flicked it now. I just have to flip it.
Okay. You flick it for me.
I will.
You will. You do because technical things.
Okay. It's flicked, so everything you say will be heard. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. I know that we're starting just a few minutes late, but the FPA is very delighted to have Chris Patten here, the last governor of Hong Kong, who will introduce his new book, The Hong Kong Diaries, which I hope most of you will have received a link to NetGalley, and if you haven't, I will be sending it around later on again. So, as usual, my introduction is going to be very, very short because I do want Lord Patten to start talking about the book and we want to launch into questions pretty quickly. We then have quite a lot of interviews to get through before he leaves. So, Lord Patten, if you can start off with a few opening remarks about this book. What is the difference between this book and East West, which was about you being the last governor of Hong Kong, which was very well received? What prompted you to write another one? So the difference and why now? Is there a specific reason? Of course, it's the 25th anniversary of the handover. What new light is shed by this book? Over to you.
Okay, and first,
Yeah, it's flicked.
I'm all right.
Yes, you are.
I have to say, allowing me anywhere near any piece of technology is a bit like allowing Kim Jong-un near a nuclear weapon. I mean, I'm really incompetent about technology. Is it working? Can you hear me?
I think. Try now.
Is that better? No or yes?
Yes.
No? No. We make progress.
Sorry.
I'll undress if you have to.
Try now.
Okay?
I hope so,
All
and
right.
if not, we have a last resort.
Otherwise I'll shout. I hate these karaoke things. Apologise.
Right. That's it with this one. And I'll hold this for you.
It's all right. I don't like that.
I don't know what's making that noise. Something's
It
making
was
that
a
noise.
Japanese contribution to our... All right, I'll speak up. And first of all, apologise for being late. The last time I was here in this room, I was a European commissioner. Happy days. But as you know, something's happened since then. Late, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity this morning of demonstrating that I exist. And this diary does the same thing. You may have read in the last few days that among the many things which Beijing communists have been trying to change in Hong Kong is the curriculum and the education system. For totalitarians, education is the engineering of the soul rather than the educating of children. And the school textbooks in Hong Kong have now been changed to eliminate any reference to Hong Kong having been a British colony. So I'm delighted to be able to demonstrate as the last governor of the British colony of Hong Kong, that I do actually exist, that I'm not a figment of my own imagination, and these diaries, I hope, do the same thing. Historical nihilism, as totalitarians usually call an attempt to base history on facts and evidence, is one of the many enemies which Xi Jinping identified when he became dictator in China, of the things against which the Chinese Communist Party had to struggle, all the aspects of an open society, one of which is proper historical inquiry. I think the Chinese Communist Party should be a little careful in how it handles these things, though, because
I'm really sorry. I don't know what's happening. You are really like Kim Jong-un with a nuclear weapon. Everything around you doesn't work anymore. Sorry for... Let's try now. Chris, try to talk.
I'm trying to talk again.
Something is scratching.
It's all these. There was a time, he said, when people used to do shorthand.
I'm really sorry about this. These normally work perfectly. I've tried every single one of them, and I think you've cast a magic spell on them.
No, there are, I guess, it's flattering, but there are too many, and they cut across one another. Anyway, the point I was going to make is that rather than calling it a colony, the Chinese Communist Party wishes to have it called an occupied territory. But it's a bit of an own goal, because you have to ask yourself who occupied it. And of course, overwhelmingly, Hong Kong has been occupied by refugees or the family or descendants of refugees from the brutalities of communism on the mainland. At the time of the communist takeover in China, the population of Hong Kong was about 600,000. If you look at the steep increase of the population of Hong Kong in the 60s and 70s and subsequently, you realize that Hong Kong was largely dependent for its growth on people who stowed away to get to Hong Kong, like Jimmy Lai, who swam to get to Hong Kong, who clambered over razor wire to get to Hong Kong. So the occupation was by refugees who found a safe haven in, wait for it, a British colony, which they turned into one of the most successful cities in the world. An open society which brought together economic and political freedom to an extraordinarily successful degree. While I was in Hong Kong, I'm not saying anything. While I was in Hong Kong, I kept for the first time in my life a diary. Every day or every week for the first few years, I dictated what I'd been doing during the week and sent the tapes back to be typed up by one of my former parliamentary PAs in London. And for the last year and a half, I wrote every evening in exercise books what I'd been doing. And I'd always intended to give those diaries to the Bodleian Library in Oxford for scholars to use. But recognizing that under the Radcliffe report's proposals about ministers' memoirs or diaries, there was no stop on publishing after 15 years I'd been in Hong Kong. There was a 15-year break clause. And I thought it would be, rather than just hand the diaries over to the Bodleian Library, it might be sensible for me to look at them myself. I was encouraged by my wife to do so. At the beginning of the lockdown, there were cardboard boxes full of pages of notes in my cellar, and I set about in the lockdown editing them and turning them into the volume which is available to you now, which I hope proves reasonably satisfactorily that there was a British colony of Hong Kong and that it was a free society, described by one of the most important political scientists of the last 50 years, Sammy Finer, as the only example he could think of a society that was free, even though it wasn't totally democratic. And I think that is an extremely fair description of Hong Kong. The diary, which is much shorter than the original, though it's not been censored in any way, I'd originally reckoned that I'd written about 850,000 words, and using a formidably difficult device called Dragon on my laptop, I reduced that to about 250,000 words, which is what's available here. and it deals with, I suppose, three elements which are interwoven. The first is the impact on a family of transferring in some cases midlife to an Asian city to live. It was a huge sacrifice for my wife because she had a good career as a barrister, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without her encouragement and support. Two of my daughters were either working or at university, but would come to see us in Hong Kong reasonably regularly. My youngest daughter did most of her secondary education in Hong Kong. We also had which were better known than the governor himself, two terriers, which were formidable accompaniments for our walks around the territory. So the first part of the diary is about what's interwoven, is really about what it was like to go and live in an Asian city, which I'd known a bit because I first went there in 1979, but I'd never lived there. Secondly, it's about the part of the job which was in some respects both the easiest and least challenging, which was being mayor of Hong Kong. And I say easiest because I never had to make in Hong Kong the sort of choices about alternative ways of using resources that I'd had to make as a British minister. From the joint declaration, which I'll come back to in a moment, in 1984-85, to our departure from Hong Kong, the GDP of Hong Kong had more than doubled in real terms. The fiscal reserves of Hong Kong increased sixfold. Hong Kong was the eighth largest trading community in the world in 1997, worth about 18% of China's total GDP. We paid no sales tax. 60% of the population paid no salaries tax. The top rate of salaries tax was 2%, which was only paid by 15% of the population. What we were able to do, given the strength of the economy and the reserves, was to deal with some of the social inequities in society, not completely, but we made quite a good impact on some, in housing, in hospitals, in education, in welfare services, in dealing with the disabled and related matters. We spent quite a lot of money while our reserves were still increasing. We in fact spent so much that I was accused at one point by Beijing of being a socialist, which was quite a tribute from an allegedly communist regime. Not Marxist, but certainly Leninist. I think we'd made considerable progress while we were there in dealing with some of those social inequities. Every year we spent more, we had more money in our reserves, and we cut taxes. If I'd ever been able to do that in British politics, well, imagine. The most difficult part of the job was, of course, negotiating with China to try to safeguard one country, two systems. One country, two systems was the formula designed by Deng Xiaoping, probably in order to try to deal with the relationship between Beijing and Taiwan. And the idea was that Hong Kong should retain its way of life for 50 years after 1997, and we handed Hong Kong back to China, and its sovereignty of the colony back to China. And one country, two systems, which is called rather different things these days by people in Hong Kong. I've seen it referred to in one newspaper article as one country, two systems. So one country, two systems, which was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, its way of life, its open society, its freedom under the rule of law, all those things for 50 years. And that guarantee was included in the joint declaration, which was tabled at the UN as an international treaty, though it's of course now been breached comprehensively by China. I think it's fair to say people ask me what I thought would happen when I left. I think it's fair to say that for a few years after 1997, things didn't go too badly wrong. There was too much interference from Beijing. The Chinese government went back, the Chinese Communist Party went back on its promises to Hong Kong to develop its democratic system. But by and large, Hong Kong remained pretty much the same until Xi Jinping followed Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And just as Xi Jinping cracked down in China itself for a number of reasons, which I describe in an essay at the end of my diaries. Xi Jinping, I think, and his goons were worried by three things in particular. First of all, the success of the campaign in 2012 by Joshua Wong and others to resist the politicization of the curriculum. Secondly, in 2014, by the Occupy Central movement, which was part of the campaign for greater democracy in Hong Kong. And finally, by the campaign against the extradition treaty, which had 2 million people on the streets and was dealt with considerable brutality by the police, led by the copper who's now become the chief executive of Hong Kong, presumably knowing more about tasers and tear gas than about how to run a sophisticated and high-tech economy. So I think it's fair to say that for 10 years after 1997, maybe a bit longer, things didn't go too badly wrong, but that they've gone downhill since, as partly, I think, because Xi Jinping and his colleagues are terrified of what Hong Kong actually stands for. I think they would like a Hong Kong which has no citizens, which is, I guess, one reason why so many Hong Kongers have come to Britain to our great benefit. The most difficult question I have to answer these days is when students, for example, say to me at the end of our course, when we've qualified as a doctor or we've qualified as a lawyer, should we go back to live in Hong Kong? And it's an extremely tough question to have to answer. So the book covers all those matters. I'm delighted that it's been edited with the usual professionalism of Penguin. There are some very jolly photos in the book. I hope there are one or two pen portraits of people which you will be able to identify without too much difficulty. And I hope it will encourage a wider debate about Hong Kong, because I think the things that Hong Kong stands for, the freedoms which have been the characteristics of Hong Kong's sense of citizenship, are important to all of us. I do think that in the years ahead, liberal democracies will find themselves having some challenges from the Putin-Xi axis. Mr. Xi, as you know, has become Mr. Putin's accomplice in Ukraine. And I think that when that is over, we won't be able to forget that. And we will need to ensure that while we share this planet as well as we can with authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, we do so without losing our own freedoms in liberal societies, and indeed by using those freedoms in order to ensure that others can, in due course, enjoy the same sort of openness and rule of law which Hong Kong has been so spirited in fighting for. So that's the Hong Kong Diaries. Go out and buy them by the bucket load, and I'm delighted to answer any questions you have. Questions aren't compulsory. If you have no questions, I'll go off and sign
Chris,
some books.
I'll kick off with a couple of
Okay.
questions. I hope that my mic is working as well. I wanted to start talking a little bit about enemies. There is quite a lot of material in the book where you meet a lot of people who don't think the same way as you. But there is a feeling that your most formidable enemies were within the Foreign Office. What do you say to that?
Well, I say it's not really true. I mean, it's true about Sir Percy Craddock and one or two others. But inevitably, I think people pick up what I say about some, like Craddock himself. It was Sir Percy Craddock who said to me, as he'd said to others, that the leadership in China may be thuggish dictators, but they're men of their word, he said, which we know that part of that is true, but not quite in the way he intended. And there were others, it has to be said, who certainly didn't agree with what I was doing. I've always thought it was quite interesting that, on the whole, Russian specialists in our Foreign Office, Sovietologists, took a pretty tough and no-nonsense line with Russia, whereas too many of the sinologists, I think, regarded China as being exceptional and deserving to be treated as though it was entirely different from everyone else and had its own narrative which had to be respected, and that you could only do business with China if you kowtowed. There was that element, but I couldn't possibly have done the job I did in Hong Kong without some wonderful Foreign Office support as well, from Robin McLaren, who was the ambassador when I arrived in Hong Kong, from Peter Ricketts, now Lord Ricketts, who was the head of the Hong Kong department and eventually became head of the Foreign Office, ambassador to NATO, ambassador to France, national security advisor. Hugh Davis, who ran with Alan Paul, our joint liaison group team, which was doing all the negotiating of day-to-day difficult stuff with the Chinese. Bob Pierce, who was my political advisor. John Ashton, whose expertise encompasses not only the Chinese Communist Party but the mafia. May not be too much difference between the two in some respects. So all those diplomats worked very hard for me, but there were some, it's true, who thought I was wrong, and even though I was always going to get political support from the government, and did, thought that they could question, particularly in the last 2.5 years, question what I was doing. The other group, I've been rather circumspect in what I've said about them, are the Hong Kong Civil Service under Anson Chan, who was the best public servant I've ever worked with. She was absolutely astonishing. And the Hong Kong Civil Service was terrific too. I was reminded of how good they were the other day by the death of one of them who was prominent in our negotiating teams, who was the Secretary for the Civil Service, before that the Secretary responsible for Constitutional Affairs, Michael Z, who died just a few weeks ago, who was a really great and brave man. And they had to be a lot braver than I've ever had to be, because of what Steve Vines, the Observer journalist, calls the White Terror in Hong Kong, the Ta Kung Pao and Wen Wei Po, and the United Front activists who targeted civil servants who were supporting the, I repeat, colonial power.
I also wanted to ask you about the rule of law. There's quite a lot, especially in your last essay at the end of the book, about the importance of the rule of law and how Hong Kong is desperately trying to hold on to that. However, I wanted to bring it to the political situation now here and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I wonder whether you can comment on how the British government can be seen to represent the rule of law when it's actually doing exactly what China has done with the breach of the joint declaration by passing legislation last week which breaches an international treaty deposited at the UN. Well,
I've made speeches about that, including in the European Parliament. I've written articles about it. I don't think that the breaches of, or the threatened breaches of international law by Mr. Johnson and his colleagues are quite on a par with the locking up of Jimmy Lai or Martin Lee, or the threatened locking up of Cardinal Zen and others. The denial of due process to people. I don't think they're quite in the same category, but I do think it's very, very difficult for the British government to take a stand on rule of law issues if it's going to break international agreements at will itself. And in the case of the Northern Ireland Protocol, first of all, one has to remember that it was negotiated by the British government and was the Boris Johnson's response to the previous proposal that Britain should remain in the customs union and the single market while leaving the European Union. He opposed that, and the Northern Ireland Protocol was his solution with Lord what's he called, Frost, who is to diplomacy what the chainsaw is to chiropody. The Northern Ireland Protocol is not easy to work, but I think the Commission, if they could have trusted Mr. Johnson more, would have been more explicit about the changes that they're happy to make, and I don't think that there's any doubt that they are prepared to negotiate changes to make it a rather easier regime. Secondly, there's no question that a very large number of businesses, not least agri-food businesses in Northern Ireland, regard being both in the European Union for goods and purposes, for exporting, for example, and in the United Kingdom, gives them the best of all worlds, which is why the Northern Ireland economy has been doing better than most other regional economies in Britain. So, but what is above all a danger with the Northern Ireland Protocol threatened legislation is the damage which it's likely to do to the Good Friday Agreement, which I helped to secure by the reform of the policing after it had happened. The Good Friday Agreement is probably the most important step forward in peace negotiated by the British government in the last 50 years. And to threaten that in order to, one, try to appease right-wing Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, and B, the DUP, is reckless in the extreme. So I think that makes clear that I'm not in favour of what the government is doing.
Very clear. I'd like to open it to questions, so please raise your hand, and when I come to you, just say who you are and who you work for. Nilas and then Ali.
Yeah, Nilas from the Danish newspaper Politiken.
I watched Borgen for the first time last night. Much enjoyed. I'd vote for that Prime Minister.
Wait, Nilas, just we'll see if this works. Nilas is here. Thank you, Pen. No, tap it. Like here.
Can I yell instead? No, I'm very curious what you then answer the people from Hong Kong when they ask you what to do, because I mean, you must be torn between standing in front of a human being and then the principle of the society that you have is a great affection for us all. So if you could just elaborate a bit on the dilemma that you find yourself in.
The worst thing in politics is when you're not entirely convinced by your own answers to questions. I'll tell you a story. Last year, it must have been in break between lockdowns, I was taking one of my dog, another Norfolk Terrier, for a walk in the Isabella plantation in Richmond Park. And 4 young people came up to me in the early 20s who were obviously Chinese. And one of them said to me, "You don't remember me, do you?" So I said, rather political answer, "Well, I'm sure I'm..." So he said, "I'm a student at Oxford, and I'm doing my doctorate in dealing with diabetes, researching on diabetes." And he said, during the Occupy Central, when you were talking to all the Chinese students in the university, you had your photograph taken with me holding a yellow umbrella. So he introduced me to his girlfriend and to the two friends they were with, another guy and his girlfriend. And they were all students, professionals. And he said to me, "So what would you say to us when we finish our degrees? Do you think we should go back to Hong Kong, or do you think we should try to stay here or go somewhere else?" And I blethered. I talked about Nelson Mandela's remark about not being able to lock up an idea. And I said that I thought that the ideas which were represented by the notion of Hong Kong citizenship were more powerful than notions which only survived because people were locked up if they didn't accept them. So I said all that, and this young doctor's girlfriend, burst into tears. And I realized that what I couldn't do is to give advice which was suggesting that they should be more brave, more courageous than I've ever had to be. A month ago, I was back at my own school in London. I give a prize to a sixth former there every year. And while I was there at the school, I met the new chemistry teacher, who was from Hong Kong. He'd come a couple of months before with his family, bought a house in Kingston. The following day I was in Oxford, and I'm parked just next to the Sheldonian Theatre. And there's a family standing on the curbside, looking rather intently at me through the window. And I got out of the car, and they were, of course, from Hong Kong, a mum and dad, and their son, who was a young doctor, who was applying for a job with the Oxford Health Authority. And it's pretty heartbreaking when you see what's happened to those people who identify themselves as Hong Kong Chinese, Hong Kongers, but aren't proud of the fact that Hong Kong has reverted to Chinese sovereignty, the occupied territory. And I just find it intensely difficult. I do believe that Hong Kong is a great city. I hope it will be a great city again. But if you have to lock up 90-year-old cardinals, or threaten to, because they raised money to help pay for people's legal costs, what hope is there in a system like that? Are we really to suppose that this is the system which is going to rule the world? So I find the whole thing very distressing, and I found it very distressing editing my diaries against the background of what was happening in Hong Kong. So I'm afraid I can't give you an easy, pat answer to that question. All I can do is to express my deep sadness about what is happening. Now, I was talking to somebody who was an old friend in Hong Kong, very prosperous lawyer, who described himself as the only member of the Labour Party in Hong Kong. And I was explaining to him my worries about the rule of law. And he said, there's no problem about the rule of law. So I went through quite calmly all the things that had bothered me. And he said, oh, he didn't know all that. He'd have to think about it. And then he went on to explain to me that he'd just bought a new boat. And you think to yourself, would I behave the same? You think to yourself that it's understandable, I suppose, that sometimes human greed trumps concern about values. And maybe the Chinese Communist Party are more correct in their analysis of human behavior. But I don't know. I couldn't live like that. Sorry, that's a long answer. A not very satisfactory answer to your question.
Ali, let's...
Thank you. Ali Hajuk, African News Agency. Bearing in mind that Hong Kong was a very thriving economy, and as the communist regime has actually cracked down on media in Hong Kong, and also the problem that they have breached the joint agreement, do you think that the presidency has actually, or is killing the golden goose? Thank you.
There are two avian metaphors which you can use about Hong Kong. One is the golden goose, the other is the canary down the mine. And I think it's certainly true that those of us who used to argue that the rest of the world would look at how China treated Hong Kong in the same way one thinks about the canary down the mine were probably correct. That if China couldn't allow Hong Kong to thrive and continue to prosper in freedom, then it told you some pretty bad things about what China would be like across the board. Golden goose? Well, I think geese require lots of things in order to fly. And to abuse the metaphor, the wings that are provided by open information and the rule of law are rather important. So people will go on making a lot of money in Hong Kong for a bit. But we already know about the number of people who are leaving for Singapore or Dubai. And very often because of the threat to a free information flow, which is very important to a modern economy. And I think that the golden goose is going to be more important given the problems that the Chinese economy is starting to face. The person I follow most closely in talking about the Chinese economy is George Magnus, who wrote an extraordinary piece in the Times. He's a very good economist, about a week ago, about the impact, among other things, not only of the increase in reliance on state-owned enterprises and the squeeze put on the private sector, but also in the immediate future, the impact of the zero COVID policy and China's embrace of Russia during the Ukraine crisis. I think the Chinese economy is getting into a pretty difficult shape. I think China faces, as well as economic problems, for example, the size of indebtedness. Local government debt in China is in total twice as great a size as the entire German economy. There is the demographic problem with not only an aging population, but also extraordinary gender imbalance as you go down the age range. Between the ages of 10 and 20, there's almost a 20% imbalance between boys and girls, men and women, which has extraordinary implications for China's workforce a few years, and China's society a few years down the road. And then you have the environmental problem with most of China's water being in the south and a great deal of the necessity for water being in the north. So those are all big problems. Now, I'm not saying that in order to imply that in Western open societies in North America or in Europe we don't have big problems as well. We do, above all, in making our democracies function rather better, which I think is a big challenge in the United States. It's a big challenge here and in parts of Europe. So, but I do think that we're dealing today with a post-peak China, and I think that it's going to rue the day that it thought that it could depend on a sophisticated international trading and financial hub in Hong Kong without the rule of law and without the freedoms that we'd normally associate with it.
Mark, and then I'll take two from here, Latika and you, and then I've seen you, Amelia. So Mark is down there. Sorry, Pen.
Thank you. Mark Landler with the New York Times. I just wondered, Mr. Patton, whether you could elaborate a bit more on what you were just saying, but as it applies specifically to Xi Jinping himself. There's been some talk that his no COVID policy has put him in, under some political pressure, unlike what he's faced since he's been president, and that there's actually more dissent internally than we might know facing him. And so, number one, I'd like your sense for what you think of his position. And then secondly, whether the stresses China is facing increase the likelihood it could try something really dangerous like a move on Taiwan.
Okay. First of all, I'm partly because of the years I spent as a European Commissioner, as well as my years in Hong Kong, I'm very, very skeptical about my or our ability to really tell what is going on behind the walls of the Zhongnanhai any more than we could behind the walls of the Kremlin. Let me give one example. A friend of mine was Margaret Thatcher's Europe Minister in 1989. Never an easy thing to be. But he went to Berlin as part of his ministerial duties. And he'd just been at a conference of great experts on Russia and Germany, one of whom had made a speech about how he didn't expect there to be reunification of Germany in his lifetime. This was a guy who'd spent his whole life working on Germany. And this was in 1989. The day my friend was in Berlin, a kid was shot trying to swim the canal, not climb the wall, out of Berlin. And my friend wanted to make a fuss about it. And his colleagues, the officials with him said, "Oh, wouldn't do that, Minister. I mean, we've got a very good relationship at the moment between West Berlin and East Berlin, and we can handle these things more delicately than that." Well, as my friend pointed out, 3 weeks later, no wall, no East Berlin, no East Germany, all swept away, and all those experts sucking their thumbs and wondering how it had happened. When I am asked about the politics inside the Zhongnanhai, I think it's rather like being a Martian or somebody from outer space looking at a sailing regatta. I mean, I'm not a sailor. when I see a sailing regatta, I can tell there's something going on. I can tell there's some sort of competitive enterprise going on, but I don't know whether it's just started or just finished or just halfway through, or who's winning, who's losing. So it's a long way of saying, I'm sure there is fierce political competition within every totalitarian regime, and you don't know about it until things come crashing down. And I guess the same is probably true of the paranoid in the Kremlin now. But I read what you and others, people in China, say about picking up grumbles about what's happening with the zero COVID policy, the impact on Shanghai and elsewhere. I read what they say about the difficulty with which China is trying to pick its way over the tightrope as an accomplice of Russia in Ukraine. And obviously that does all have some political consequences for Xi's hold on power, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it from the outside. But it would just be improbable if you can live in an echo chamber, as dictators do like that, and not hearing anything that you don't want to hear, and not put an awful lot of people's backs up. I think what is true about China is that there has, with Hu Jintao, for example, Jiang Zemin, even Deng Xiaoping, been a way in which people could express their doubts about current policy or their views about how policy could develop. And that does appear to have been snuffed out, which I don't think is very good news for the longevity of the system. I mean, I think back to probably the most remarkable international public servant I've ever encountered. I met him a few times, Zhu Rongji, who clearly had quite an impact in shifting Chinese economic policy into more sensible directions. And if you don't have anybody questioning, for example, the present balance between the private sector and state-owned enterprises, if you don't have anybody raising questions about whether the zero COVID policy actually makes very much sense if you're locking down people in the way that Shanghai and other places have been locked down, if you don't have those questions being asked, I think sooner or later it produces big political tensions. It would be amazing if it didn't. Your second question was about, sorry, I went on to Taiwan. Well, I tell you what interests me. On the one hand, Xi Jinping must know more about Taiwan than almost anyone else, because he spent most of his political career as he came up, or a lot of it, looking at Taiwan across the straits, from where he was posted. So he must know what an incredibly dangerous enterprise it would be if it's difficult for the Russians to march into eastern Ukraine. Think about assaulting an island after a 100-kilometer or 100-mile journey across sea, with not many beaches you can land on, with mountains and cliffs. It's not exactly straightforward. And I guess Xi Jinping will look at the way the world has reacted to the invasion of Ukraine with some concern. But I have friends who know more about China than I do, who now talk about the possibility of an attack on Taiwan as a more credible threat than they would ever have thought it was likely to be in the past. So my gut instinct is it's so dangerous a thing for Xi Jinping to try. That I hope the system will encourage him not to do it. But the fact that we're even talking about it now is plainly rather a worry. Not very helpful answer to your question. I think that the relationship between Ukraine and Taiwan is is of some concern. I mean, China had a very good relationship with Ukraine. Huawei was pretty well had the freedom of the road in Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of money borrowed in Ukraine for developments. I imagine all those developments have been now blown up by the Russian artillery. Ukraine was a strong business partner, grain, energy. So China must have known quite a bit about Ukraine, though you do wonder now, there's a good piece in The Economist, I think a week or so ago, you do wonder now about the quality of the Chinese espionage service. I mean, they're obviously very good at stealing secrets from people or promoting United Front activity, but their analysis, if they really believed what Putin was telling them about what a straightforward job it was going to be to take out Ukraine, then if I was Xi Jinping, I'd want to change some of the people who've been actually doing the analytical work for me. So, first point, I don't know at length. Second point, I don't know at almost as great length, but hope it's not going to happen.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. So, Latika.
Thank you. Is this on?
No, tap it. Yes.
That was great. Lord Patton, Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald. Thanks, his talk is just so fascinating. I speak for everyone in the room saying that. You used the word totalitarian a couple of times. Can you describe when you began to call the Chinese government that in your own mind? When you were in Hong Kong, did you subscribe to this view whether that they would eventually democratise, that they would modernise in line with Western expectations? And given what we now know of Russia and Europe's difficulty in dealing with its gas dependence, is the West decoupling itself from China speedily enough? Britain, for example, last year raised its imports from China by 16%.
Well, the second point first. We shouldn't kid ourselves that by buying goods from us or trading with us, the Chinese are doing us a big favour. Or by investing here, they're acting like the St. Vincent de Paul Society. They buy what they want at the best price they can get. And they do that regardless, I think, usually of politics. But they of course, make use of the fact that they've often bullied us or cowed us into thinking we can only do business with them if we accept their political narrative. I think it's pretty good drivel. But people go on believing it. If you look at the trade figures for this country, and then I'll talk about the trade figures under the sinner condemned for 1,000 generations, me. From over a 40-year period till 2018, 2019, our exports to China were going up in real terms by just over 3% a year. Our imports from China were going up by over 9% a year. So the trade deficit was large and growing. So I don't say that the Chinese need us, but who's doing best out of that if you look at it entirely in mercantilist terms? In the period before I became governor, and this isn't post hoc propter hoc, as we would say at Oxford, it's what life is like. In the period before I was governor, our exports to China went down. We were trying, though we were reasonably robust over Tiananmen. We were trying to stand up to China occasionally. We were trying to do as much business as possible. And during that period, our exports to China went down. Well, I was governor, prostitute, triple violator, tango dancer, and all that, being scolded for doing things which made me sound like Thomas Paine. They were pretty modest. But I made the terrible mistake of, as far as they were concerned, of involving the people of Hong Kong in what was happening. But during that period, we had the fastest growth in exports of any OECD country. So what do you deduce from that? That annoying the Chinese Communist Party was bad for British exports? It was easy to say if you were a marketing director of a British company that wasn't very well run, that if you didn't get a deal in China, it was all because of Governor Patton. But, pull the other one. So I think that's we've allowed ourselves to accept a narrative which is barking. And if it was true, and when it is true, for example, the way that Australia was treated after it demanded a WHO inquiry into the start of coronavirus, where it is true and they behave badly, we should all take it up with them. We should all work together, not say, oh, poor old Australians, we'll see if we can get rid of the market instead. We actually have to work together as liberal democracies. Otherwise, you get bullied one by one. When did I first start calling Chinese totalitarian? As a story I tell in my in these diaries, which you can't wait to rush out and buy. Visiting a mental hospital in the New Territories, and it was being rebuilt, and there were lots of the wards were all in porta cabins with wire around them where people could go for a walk out of their cabin, but a long sort of sentier, a long alley down the middle. And I'm walking down this alley with my several doctors and my bodyguards and so on. And suddenly there's a Chinese guy, about 45, in a three-piece suit, rattling the wire outside his porta cabin, saying, speaking very good English, saying, oh, Governor Patton, Pang Ting Hong, could I ask you a question? So I walked across to the horror of the people with me. And he said to me, Pang Ting Hong, he said, would you agree that Britain is the oldest parliamentary democracy in the world? And I said, certainly we could make that claim. And he said, and would you say that China was the last great communist power in the world? And I said, well, I wouldn't put it in quite those terms, it wouldn't be very diplomatic, but I see what you mean. So he said, well, could you explain to me, Governor, he said, why you, as a representative of an old democracy, are handing over a free society to the last communist tyranny without asking the people here what they think? And I said to my officials afterwards, it is part of life's horrible ironies that the man with the most important question in Hong Kong is in a mental hospital. But it was true. And even though it was a more modest form of sort of neo-totalitarianism then, it was Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, and it wasn't very long since Tiananmen, but nevertheless, there were reasons for hoping that things would get easier. But I don't think I was ever as deluded as some people in thinking there was an automaticity about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom, that an economy growing would automatically produce political change. It's a rather Marxist view, actually. I don't think I really believed it. And I certainly have never really believed in the middle income trap, that there is a particular economic figure which once you go past it, you fetch up inevitably becoming democratic. Tony Blair, whom God preserve, Tony Blair, when China signed the WTO, said that the move in China to democracy was now unstoppable. Well, what happened? I mean, we've always deluded ourselves and hoped for the best, but hoping for the best is not a very good basis for policy. And I have always believed that the most important sentence in George Kennan's long telegram of 1946 about the Soviet Union, most important sentence, which is, I think, applicable to Chinese communism, not to China, but to Chinese communism, was when George Kennan said, to get it right, we have to understand that their view of reality and ours is incompatible. Incompatible. And I think that's true. And of course, we have to manage the planet in a way which includes China and that Chinese market. We can't deal with climate change without involving China. We can't deal with epidemics, as we know, without China actually keeping its word when it signs agreements with the WHO. But I don't think we should delude ourselves. I think we have to be pretty clear about what is our real interest, and we have to constrain China, not contain it, but constrain it. And the very last point I make about this, somebody who became a friend of mine in Hong Kong was a guy who was beyond feisty. Whatever feisty means, double it and double it again. A journalist called Jonathan Mirsky, who had started life as a scholar of China. He was a fan of Mao, and partly, I think, because he was an active campaigner against the Vietnam War when he was at American University. He became a scholar of China, and the more he learned about China and the more time he spent there, the more critical he became. He was covering China as the Observer's correspondent in 1989, at the time of Tiananmen. I was actually there, but not at the time of the killings. And Jonathan, who at the end of when he was escaping from Tiananmen Square, had his arm broken, most of his teeth knocked out, was rescued actually by Robert Thompson, who was then working, I guess, for the Times in Beijing. And Mirsky is standing with a group of students. And one of these kids, as they're hearing the rifle shots, says to him, "Don't worry, old man," he said, they're only firing rubber bullets. At almost that point, this kid falls into Mirsky's arms with a bloody hole in the middle of his forehead. Mirsky, I learnt a number of things from, and one of them is when people do things that are wicked, you should say they're wicked. You shouldn't think it's soppy. You shouldn't think that somehow realpolitik means that you shouldn't say that. What the Russians are doing in the Ukraine at the moment is wicked. Putin is a wicked man. Now, you have to deal with him at some point, but call him out. And when the Chinese do things which are wrong, I think of Jonathan, who died about 3 months ago. A really, really fine man, but I've never known anybody who stormed out of more dinner parties or more cocktail parties because he was so pissed off by what people were saying about democracy or the rule of law or whatever, including in our own countries. I never forget Jonathan's absolute determination to say things were wrong when they were wrong. So I don't think he'd have agreed with the Catholic Church about its alleged pact with the Chinese Communist Party. I think he'd have had some difficulty with Henry Kissinger's remarks about Ukraine. And I think I'd have been on Jonathan's side, even though I don't tend to storm out of dinner parties because I like food too much.
Okay, very last two questions, because we promised them, please promise to answer them very, very snappily.
All right.
And
Sorry to bang on
you
so
please,
much.
I don't know your name, and Paloma. Let's take them together, if that's okay.
Lord Patton, Chad Murray from the South China Morning Post. A couple things. One is to follow on that point. Is there a point in all of this where the business community, you mentioned in your book, a number of people in the business community are willing to sort of turn a blind eye to what's happening, try to separate politics from business? And so is there a point, whether it's your COVID or something else, that the business community will stand up and say something? We've seen lots of British banks, American banks, and other companies come. Second, do you have any advice that you'd like to give John Lee?
You'd like to give who?
John Lee, the new chief executive, as he approaches the handover anniversary here on the 25th. Thank you.
I think
And let's take one
Okay.
from Paloma there, and then we can condense them.
From Spain, for the radio and television. As today is the World Refugees Day, and you've been comparing somehow Taiwan and Ukrainian situations. What do you think about, we know we have more or less 77,000 Ukrainian refugees now in UK, most of them women and children. What about their situation or their welcoming and the Hong Kong refugees here nowadays? What do you think? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'll be brief. First of all, I'm pleased at how enthusiastically the Hong Kong refugees here have been welcomed. And I see quite a lot of them. I'm patron of an organisation called Hong Kong Watch, which has good relations with them. And I think that there is an understanding in this country about the very positive contribution which the Hong Kong Chinese community is making to the communities they've settled in here. I think our huge gain is Hong Kong's huge loss. And I'm sorry that it's happening, but I'm delighted that we're being honourable about our responsibilities. And of course, other countries are doing the same. The one thing I would like to do is to have some more generous scholarship provisions for young Hong Kongers at our universities, but we keep on talking about that. My one piece of advice to Mr. Lee would be to encourage his wife and children to keep their British passports. On the first question, what was the first one?
When the business can...
I just think that it's not very sophisticated for any business to think that, as it were, the law for, as somebody once said, for Mr. MacDonald is different from the law for Ronald McDonald. I think sooner or later the law for you and me is the same as the law that businesses have to deal with. And I think quite a few businesses banks who've been working in Hong Kong are aware of the extent that they have to decide whether they're Western banks or Chinese banks, and it's quite difficult bridging that divide. But I hope that people go on working in Hong Kong and making money in Hong Kong. I just think that it would be nice if some of those who are in senior positions in businesses in Hong Kong were concerned about what's happening to the people who work for them, and not just aware of the fact that if things don't go too well, they've always got the ability to go and live somewhere in the Surrey Hills or in Brookline, Massachusetts, or somewhere else where there's a nice golf course. I mean, responsibilities in business, which we bang on about, corporate responsibility. Responsibilities include considering the environment in which your workforce have to live. So, yeah, I hope that Hong Kong continues to succeed. When I was governor of Hong Kong, a colony, when I was governor of Hong Kong, it used to surprise people that I used to go and lobby the Clinton administration and Nancy Pelosi and others about MFN status for China, because I always thought that it wasn't going to do Hong Kong any good if there was a big fight with China, and that it wouldn't do Hong Kong any good if it was suffering economically. So I would never want Hong Kong not to do other than well, but I just think it's more difficult for it to do well when some of its best people are leaving, and when some of the ingredients which go into a successful mixed economy are being diminished. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. If you want to have a glass of water. Can we have Nikkei TV first? And I don't see Lorenzo Amuso anywhere, so after Nikkei, if
Will you
Dana from NHK can get ready. Dana and Yusuke.
I think the SCMP are going to take over. I think the SCMP are going to take an excerpt.
Thank you.
Well, you'll have to ask somebody, because I'm not.
I speak up to the peer.
Yeah, well, will you?